Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for waiting. Um, I was just waiting to see if a few more people would join in from the Eventbrite, but it looks like we have a nice, cozy group today. So my name is James, and I've been developing web apps for about 15 years, and so I'm pretty excited to give this workshop today. Um, basically, every couple of weeks, me and some other colleagues and friends are just putting on some workshops, and is to make a nice community where people can come together and support each other while they're learning new coding skills. But before we start, it would be really cool to hear just from some of you. How did you find out about the workshop, and what's your coding experience like so far? So yeah, if you uh, can just throw that in the chat, that would be super helpful.
Also allowed to talk or only chat?
I turned the mic on because it's a small group. So yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. Well, first getting into how I found the workshop, I guess. I reached out to you, I think, like a year ago or so, through a mutual friend, Nick, that you met, I believe, from aerospace.
Yeah,
Uh, so I basically have you as a friend or a connection on LinkedIn and saw it on my timeline. I was like, okay, interesting. Regarding my own coding experience, I'm not sufficient at all in full stack. I do Python programming, which I learned in my engineering degree. But I am very interested because I have been working together with some other people building some Next.js applications. And I would love to just gain some deeper understanding and also get some insights in the different tools that are out there, especially regarding AI. You have all of this ways how you can really accelerate your coding, not only your learning experience, but
yeah,
also increasing your output very quickly.
yeah.
So
Cool.
very interesting. And also in the web space, like you have all these different abstractions coming now that makes it really easy to build on top of cool things that other people have built already. So yeah, that's it for me.
Have you ever used JavaScript before?
Yeah, so I built one AI chatbot, a pretty simple like RAG system, and linked it to it was based on Next.js and TypeScript.
Okay.
But what I did there, basically, I just took an existing repo and then just started like trial and error manipulating stuff. So that's all the things I did in terms of like JavaScript development.
And how did you find TypeScript? Easy, difficult, based on your experience?
Um, well, I feel like with every coding language, it is pure logic. You just need to learn all the syntaxes and all of that. So yeah, it was pretty straightforward, I guess.
Okay. Nice, cool. And then we have a message from Jose. He says, "I have no microphone and camera. Hello, I reached out the webinar on LinkedIn, and I'm a junior AI developer, no JavaScript or React knowledge." Cool. Rango?
I saw your LinkedIn post and I thought I'd join. Basically, I have some coding experience. I did a PhD and mostly in MATLAB and some Python. And like I'm working on my own startup at the moment. I built like the first version of it on Create React app and Python backend. I've also spent like 3 months as an Angular developer at some point in my job. So I have like
Cool.
bits and pieces of experience. And right now we've moved over to Next.js. So I just wanted to see like, yeah, what are the things that we could be doing to speed up development, basically.
Nice. Are you coding with Next.js yourself?
Yeah. I won't say well, but yes.
Okay, cool, awesome. So then we have like a pretty good range of experience from beginner to people that have coded quite a bit. So I'll just try, and for this workshop, what I'll try and do is I'll go through the first 10 minutes. That some of it might seem a bit basic, but maybe you'll learn something new. And then I'll go over the basics of React, and then I'll go through the demos, which I think will be probably most interesting for you two that have already been coding. Yeah, and then we can just build some things together, and we can look at basically, I can show you how I use AI to code React apps pretty fast, and we can go from there. So yeah, so let's start. So when a lot of people hear the word JavaScript, another word that comes to mind pretty quickly is often why. Like, why does this language even exist? I mean, it's become really big, over the past 10, 20 years. On the one hand, it's just one of the most used and most sought after developer skills. And the other hand, it's just found its way into everything from front end, back end, mobile, and desktop. And it's just become this sort of pervasive language that's everywhere. And so I wanted to actually go back in time to just a few months after I was born, actually, was 1994. And JavaScript was not invented yet, but at that point in time, there was the first web browser. And so in 1994, you could actually go to, I don't know myself, but from what I've heard, you could go to pizzahut.com and you could actually put in your name, address, and phone number and order a pizza. And the way that the internet worked back then is it was basically like every time you'd submit a form or go to a website, you would download, your web browser would download a document and display that. And if you wanted to change, if the website wanted to change anything, you'd have to download a new page. There were forms at the beginning, but that was the only kind of interaction. It was always a document being passed back and forth across the internet, and all of the computation was done on the server side. And that was until JavaScript. So when JavaScript was brought in, was invented, you could basically run code on the client side, therefore being able to do things like form validation. So in 1996 was the first version of JavaScript officially. And in 1999, this was probably the biggest feature to be added, was Ajax. And the acronym is not relevant anymore, but the A, standing for asynchronous, basically means that in addition to being able to change things on the page, then JavaScript got the upgrade where it could actually access data on the internet, so we could make web requests without reloading the page. So I think the best example of this was, really shortly after JavaScript was upgraded, Gmail came out. And the most revolutionary thing about Gmail, the first version of Gmail was in 2001. And the most revolutionary thing about it was that you could refresh here, this refresh button, and it would download all of your new emails without reloading the page. And that's essentially what Ajax is. And that's been a very, very core feature of JavaScript, and one of the things that makes it so useful. Before then, there was no way to either send or receive data without reloading the page. And then here's another further example, just a little bit further on. Here's an example of, a Facebook news feed in 2010, and you see all of these examples. On the left side, you just have like a regular JavaScript. Okay. Maybe submit a status update, and then that would make a web request in the background. Same with the like button, that'll make a web request in the background to tell the server to save this like somewhere. And then the inbox notification number is basically just probably every 30 seconds or 1 minute or so, it's downloading an Ajax request from the server. So that was the early days of JavaScript. And then in 2006, this thing called jQuery came out. And basically, as people were making their applications more and more complex, so you saw the Facebook timeline, for example, they were just writing more and more JavaScript code, and a lot of that code became redundant. So this is an example up at the top of a standard JavaScript action, sorry, a standard JavaScript line of code, which you might write. And if we just go through it step by step, the first part says document.getElement by ID, my button. So it's referencing a button in the HTML called my button. It's adding the event listener click. So it's sort of it's registering to be notified every time the button is clicked. And then it's changing the text content of the button to clicked. So all of this code just to say, okay, when the button is clicked, change the text on the button to say clicked. And then if you look down at the version with jQuery, it's the same thing. Here, instead of saying get element by ID, we're using this hash. And then instead of add event listener, we've just shortened that whole thing down to just click. And then instead of text content, we have another way of referencing to that button to change the text. And that's basically what jQuery was. And that's why it became so popular from 2006 to 2012, because the original JavaScript language, it just seemed so verbose. As developers were writing more and more code, they didn't want to write all of that. And it actually became so popular that it still exists on around 80% of websites today, although only 20% of people are actually still developing with jQuery. So what happened after jQuery? Well, just around the time that jQuery was starting to lose popularity, Facebook released React.js. And at Facebook, they were developing an even sort of larger, more complex apps with more and more components, with different people in different parts of the company building components and shipping them for other parts of the company. And this sort of complexity sort of required an even greater level of abstraction. And so that's what React.js was created for. And we're about to go deeper into that. But then I'll also just add, this whole time, the JavaScript language was also not just, just staying fixed. There's a committee that makes updates to the language once in a while. And in 2015 was probably the biggest update. Classes, promises, and arrow functions. You don't need to know what those are. But these were features that were popular in other languages that JavaScript didn't have. And eventually, the pressure came upon JavaScript to add these in too. And this really modernized JavaScript, taking it from like just a kiddie language to something a little bit more serious. And the end effect here is that basically, just like with jQuery, except now officially, the amount of code you have to write to do a normal thing that you'd want to do is now smaller, more concise, and more readable. And I guess the sort of point that I'm trying to get to here is that JavaScript is really a language which, unlike some other languages, it's really been shaped over time by the things that people use it for, rather than being created for a use and then staying fixed there. It's really adapted to uses by these updates, and we see that as well with JavaScript now being used for desktop apps, mobile apps, and even Ethereum is even based off of Solidity. The language used on the Ethereum network is even based off of JavaScript. So let's get into apps. So if we'd want to look at a simple jQuery app, you have, let's just take, for example, we want to have a button, and then when you click that button, it updates account. This might be a basic example for some of you, but I think it's going to illustrate my point as to what React changed for JavaScript. So this is before React. So you'd write the HTML for your your counter. You'd write the HTML for your button, and then underneath you'd write some logic code, and you'd say, okay, start the count at 0. Every time the button is clicked, increment the count, and then and then based on that count, whatever you have now, then update the text so it has that number. And so you have the HTML at the top and the logic at the bottom. And if you'd add more more code or more items, you'd probably have more HTML at the top, and then you'd have the logic code for all of your elements at the bottom. Now, let's look at the same kind of thing, but in a React application. So in a React application, every component is a reusable component and is actually a function. So this here in this return statement is called JSX. And that's sort of a combination of HTML and JavaScript together. When you want to make a React application, you first start thinking of your application in terms of components, everything that you might reuse. So a slider, a widget, a graph, a sidebar, even icons. These are all components, and you really want to start thinking, breaking them down into components. And the reason why is because React just sort of encapsulates those. And once you've created your component once, as long as your interface is well defined, anyone can then use that slider, that navigation bar in their app or part of your app, and it really encapsulates it. And one of the things that's really exciting about, I think, coding with AI today is that React doesn't just make modular code that's more easy for humans to understand. It also makes more modular code for AI to understand. Because if you're looking at one single React component, you don't necessarily need to know what's going on outside of that. So if we just look at this sort of component here, we have a component called counter. We have something called use state. And what that's doing is it's creating a specific variable that's specific to this component. And underneath that, we're creating a function which this is an arrow function, but it could be written out longer as a normal function, and it's increasing the count of that variable. And then we're returning the JSX, which has some things inserted into it. You see here, the main difference between this code and the code that we just looked at is we don't need to manually update the HTML changes. Just like in Angular, for example, this function is automatically rendered every time the count variable changes. So it's a bit of a more abstract way of looking at things, but it really helps as your application scales up. And I have one question that I think would maybe illustrate a little bit why React uses less code as you scale up. Can someone tell me, perhaps in this code right here, if I would want to make 2 counters? Let's say I just want to have 2 counters, and one button changes one count and the other button changes the other count, and there's no connection between them. How would I do that? How would I have to change this code to do that? Anyone? Yeah.
I'm guessing you have to, just duplicate it, I guess, where you have like another count variable, and then reference the other button and increment in the same way.
Right. So I could copy and paste the first 2 lines and put them below the first 2 lines, and then I could copy and paste all this JavaScript code and then paste it again. And then And then what I'd have to do is I'd have to go back and I'd have to change the IDs of counter and increment, because otherwise they would conflict with each other. And the same thing with the count variable. You'd have to have, you'd have to name it something else. Of course, we could think of some fancy ways to make this code reusable in JavaScript, and that's what people did for a while. That's what I was doing as well before using React. But let me just show you how that would work with React. If we want to do this with React, this is it. So I think, and you can sort of imagine as you're building a larger and larger application. So this could become your page, and then you could have, your nav bar, and then your main component of the page. And then in the main component, you could have, forms, and in the forms, you could have all of these reusable components. So this is really useful. Actually, I do think that this code, if you were making like the simplest possible application like we've made just here, it might be actually confusing to use React. But as you're making a larger application, this, you can just see from this example here, React scales extremely well. Just one other thing to add, CSS is sort of just the styling component of HTML, and it allows you to, change things that aren't necessarily related to the content of the page, or at least that's the idea, but are more related to the aesthetic or visual component. So yeah, up until a few years ago, the top was the way that people would write mainly CSS. Of course, you can put this out into another part of the code. Doesn't need to be directly in the HTML, but you would sort of write it out in this attribute and then value. And that was working, but as people were making, these larger, bigger applications, it was sort of a similar thing where you'd have all your where, before the React, you'd have your JavaScript, and then you'd have your HTML, sorry, your HTML and then your JavaScript. And it was sort of the same thing with CSS. People were building all their CSS, and then you'd have to sort of connect that in. Well, that was not scaling, as easily. And so, then Tailwind CSS was invented. But essentially, all you have to realize is that that's just a bunch of shortcuts to make CSS easier to write. And one thing also to consider is that if you have a great IDE, great editor, it really helps you out by auto-completing all of these things. So yeah, Tailwind is something that you can learn in a few hours or a day, pretty much. I know a couple of you were really interested in like coding with AI. This is just my most basic strategy that I use here. I've been sort of testing out the limits of code generation since probably the beginning of this year. And you can tell right away that OpenAI's models are really good at JavaScript and Python. I've done a few sort of more detailed evaluations of their strengths and weaknesses, which I can also send you the link for. But I think to summarize, they're really good at solving sort of well-defined concrete problems. I did at the beginning, I was using it to generate a lot of boilerplate, but I realized it's not worth it to generate all of the boilerplate if you can start with a template that really works. So my method is mainly starting with a template, copying and pasting in the parts to change, and then specifically seeing which parts to change. The other model, in addition to OpenAI, that is the most competitive right now is Meta's Code Llama. And Llama is a smaller model compared to GPT, but it's open source. It's fully open source and commercially open source. So there are also forks of Code Llama as well that have been sort of fine-tuned even further. and it's still not as good as ChatGPT, but it's something to definitely keep on your radar. Another big limitation of ChatGPT for coding is just the knowledge update, and this is something that I've run into a lot. It might generate some perfectly good code that was perfectly good 1 year ago or 2 years ago. Most likely, it's normally 2 years ago. And the tricky thing is it doesn't always know what version of the library, whether it's React or another component library like say Bootstrap or something like this. It doesn't always know what version of the library it was trying to use. It just thinks that the code it's writing is the most up to date. But as these libraries are changing quite fast, some are changing fast, some are changing slow. You'll realize that I was seeing in some experiments recently that about half of the errors I was getting from ChatGPT were basically a version mismatch between what it thought was up to date and what was actually up to date. And then on top of that, just generate code, test, and repeat, and break this down into small chunks. So that's all for the that's all for the introduction. And yeah, now is the fun part where we can actually do a little bit of coding together. I saw that oh yeah, there were a couple questions here. So have you seen a big difference in performance between 3.5 and 4? This is something that I have heard a lot of, I've experienced a lot of discussion about, a lot of talk about, and it's interesting because there's also a lot of what I feel is anecdotal evidence applied to this, and that's why I'd say I really think the best thing to do is to do sort of a test for yourself, do a evaluation for yourself for the particular things that you're trying to do. So to try first with 3.5 and then with 4 a few times each, and see if there's a big difference. As far as we were talking about React, I have not seen as big a difference as I would expect. And I think it mainly depends on how frequently OpenAI is going to update the knowledge base of each of them, the training data of each of them, rather than the problem-solving ability. Because neither of them are particularly strong at solving really difficult engineering problems. They're mostly strong in just regurgitating the types of code that they've seen. I'll just put a link for the evaluations that I did in Python, and you'll see that 4 scores better. I haven't done an extensive evaluation on React yet, but we will be doing that pretty soon. And then does that answer your question? And then the question from Frank is, have you tried including the most recent documentation as extra knowledge it can use for retrieval? Oh yeah. So there's some really interesting projects that are doing this. So in my own code generation tools that I'm making, I haven't done this yet. And the reason why is because there was so much to be gained just by adjusting the versions of dependencies to match with the current knowledge level of ChatGPT. So rather than upgrading GPT, what I've done so far is downgrading the dependencies, which work very well. Now knowing that that works very well, I think the method that you're talking about, adding extra knowledge to ChatGPT. So for example, giving it access to documentation and including that in is definitely going to help. That said, it's pretty complex because you need to have a pretty good search and retrieval setup there. And there's some really good open source projects that are working on this. But I haven't seen anything that's like amazing that gets you all of the up-to-date React libraries. That might be something that I try out in the next couple of months, just taking the top 20 or top 50 or 100 most popular React libraries to improve a tool. Cool. So if that's good with everyone, we have 10 minutes, 15 minutes more, and I'd love to go through some just some examples pretty quickly. We can also follow up because I know that Rango and Frank were super interested in tools. We could definitely follow up more on some, in some future workshops. I can also demo some other tools. I also have a list of about 5,200 AI developer tools, which I can also send to you. But I think, yeah, if we just start right now by demoing a couple of things, that will probably be useful for everyone here. So yeah, so this is a tool that I made myself and that I've been working on for a few months. This is probably the most easiest way to get started to building a React application. You just go to this URL and you already have a running application. That said, you don't have to use this. If I would just click download here, then I will have here on my desktop the working template of a React application. And the foundation of a React application is just some JavaScript files. And when you, at the command line, run npm start, that is just compiled and then run in the web browser for you. It normally comes with an index.js, which is just boilerplate code. But the app.js is where you'll probably put most of your application logic. And yeah, then you have, of course, a README and a package.json, which keeps track of all of the dependencies that you've installed for your application. So yeah, this is just a tool that I've made, and right now it's free to help you to make some changes to apps using AI. So I have this command P, and I can do, for example, make a beautiful landing page. And since this is running live and it's using an LM, I don't necessarily know what it's going to create, but normally it creates something like this. So if we just look at what it's added, here we have a very simple React component, and it's added just HTML in this case. This is literally just HTML and Tailwind. We could make something a little bit more complex since this is React. I could say, add a navigation bar. And this time it also just added HTML. So we could be a little more specific. We could go back and I could say add a navigation bar. I could say add a React navigation bar, for example. And you'll notice here that now at the top, there's an import statement. And so that import statement is, it's including the code, or it's referencing the code from an open source library that is made to allow you to create multiple page applications using React. And so if we look now at the code, at the component code, you'll see that there's a number of components here. So now there's a home page, an about page, and then in this app, we have a number of components. In this app component, we also have a number of child components. So we have a router, and this router is basically saying that, oh, this is part of the code which will include multiple pages, and in there's the nav bar, which is all of the code that displays this at the top, but then at the bottom there are these route components, and what the route component is just saying is, oh, if we're at this path, then include this component, or if we're at this path, then include this component. So it should. And if you'd have a URL bar for this app, then you would see the URL changing as well. And so that's an example of a dependency, of a React dependency that you can generate code for using AI. And another thing to keep in mind is that if we look at the package JSON here, you'll see that this version that's been included is not the most recent. We've had to downgrade it a little bit to keep it up to date with the ChatGPT generated code, or the OpenAI generated code. But as Frank mentioned, this is something that can be improved in the future, that can be brought up in the future by including more context when we're generating the code. So yeah, there's a couple of examples. Now, just keeping an eye on time, is there anything else that any of you all would like to see, or to try out, or to just try and build right now?
I have maybe a bit more of a generalistic question. So the tool that you just showed, first of all, I'm curious, sort of like, how would the workflow look for a tool like this, and what would be the target audience? Is it people that have like no coding experience, or kind of like to go from 0 to 0.7 through the tool and then you do the rest yourself? And second of all, what kind of work? Maybe let's start with that, because otherwise we have too much questions going on at the same time.
No, I mean, that's a great question, because I really think that using low-code tools can be a great way to increase the productivity of an existing engineer, but it can also lower the barrier to entry for new engineers. In this case, I think this is a little bit more focused towards newer developers. There's just so many newer developers out there, and like React is one of the things that most people around the world, and mostly not in the US, but just all around the world, people are learning React. And as far as the workflow, I'd say that right now, a tool like this is really good for making small apps or components for your larger apps. We don't have right now the ability to make a bunch of files, and in general, you're going to want to split up. You're going to want to split up your large applications, into more complex architecture. We also don't do backend right now, but if you would have like a Next.js app, you can literally copy and paste the components from here into there. So I'd say right now it's really good for a small prototype, single page application. Then your workflow could be just literally download the source code and then deploy it to Vercel. You could also download it and then put it into VS Code. You could also just get a component exactly as you like it, which is something that I do a lot. So make a really great nav bar and then copy and paste that into your existing application.
Okay, cool. And what kind of workflow would you propose? So as I mentioned before, I don't have really like the overall understanding to build a more advanced application.
Mhm.
For example, I'm now working on a new startup myself, so I have the whole user experience like drawn out in Figma. I have like sketches of, let's say, the data architecture and the AI infrastructure that will use there. How can I now, like, if I were to build the MVP myself, then
Mhm.
such a big product that has multiple dependencies, multiple pages, quite some logic. How would you break that down into and maximize your efficiency and output in building an application out of it?
How complex of an application are we talking about here?
Oh, that's a good question, but I'm not going to.
How many pages and how many dependencies? Like, and what would you say is the most complex part of it? Is it like, for example, is there like a chatbot interface, or would you say is there some more drag and drop, or is there something really difficult like that, or is it more just a bunch of different pages?
It's components that are working together. So one of them is kind of like, for example, maybe you're familiar with like those planning softwares that they have in restaurants, where you have like, let's say, a horizontal bar, and you can create like a little draggable bar in it, and you have that on, let's say, multiple tables. In this case, for me, it's a different use case, of course. But then you should be able to click all of them and then have a LLM conversation with each of these different tables, for example. And then ideally within those, let's say, LLM conversations with specific parts of the table, I also want, like, let's say, the UI interface should also be kind of like the dynamic. For example, I've seen this Wanderlust example that they showed during the OpenAI Dev Day.
Oh,
kind of like, so it's kind of like, currently when you're having a conversation with an LLM, it's always replying one language, right? But sometimes you want it to respond to you with a Google Maps interface. Sometimes you want it to give you a YouTube video recommendation or whatever. So as you can see, this is there's some architecture and also how you structure your database, etc.
Right. I understand. Yeah. So yeah, I think, and you want to build, you want to get to a certain point first before you ship your product. Like you have a list of, maybe 10 features that you want to get in the MVP and then ship it, right?
Yeah, kind of. It's not 10, but yeah, there's a specific set of things that need to be included for MVP, and then
Yeah, so it sounds like then you'll need a back end, a front end, and maybe maybe need authentication as well.
Yeah.
So it's actually pretty similar to the kind of setup that that I've made for recent apps. I think I'd say there's definitely a lot involved, and it's the AI can it can take take away some of the harder parts or some of the more repetitive parts, but there's also some things like making a backend integrate with authentication that at least for me has still been pretty annoying. So I think getting the architecture first and getting that sort of the data schema and everything for the database setup is going to be a big amount of work. I think your question is like, how can you do this the easiest? I'd say you're probably still going to have to sketch out, a whole schematic of how you want everything to be and how you want the whole system to architect together before involving AI, I think. It may help to inspire you, But I think that is not gonna. I think we're not at the point where it's gonna automate away the full stack quite yet for something that complex. Yeah. But then for different components like the UI, I think it's really great for. I think we're really close to the point where it can basically generate most of the UI for you, 80% of the UI. Yeah.
Yeah, probably at some point those plan and solve agents will be really good in really executing it from the start, but we're not there yet. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd also say there's also some great low code tools, such as the that require like no or low coding to create apps, and these can be interesting for a prototype. I've never used Bubble which is the most popular one, because Bubble, the aesthetics of it, I don't really personally like it. But there's some other new ones that are for generating backends in like a more visual way, that I've looked at, and I'm thinking about doing a workshop on some of those in the future, that may help to like basically help to make a backend with little or no coding. Yeah.
Gotcha. There's this tool that actually could be interesting maybe for you as well, when you're now obviously figuring out how to make the user experience. TL Draw.
Oh, yeah.
It's
when
I saw it recently.
I was on yesterday on Twitter. Yeah.
What
cool.
The ideal, let's say, user flow of your application, if you're targeting these, let's say, starting people, is having something like TL Draw, or even like just uploading all the sketches you have of the user experience and architecture, and then it really it's like kind of like a co-pilot guiding you in the learning process of building this React app yourself.
TL Draw is very cool because it uses GPT vision to generate code, and it works pretty well. I just wanted to get back to, I know we didn't have a ton of time for demos, but Jose or Rango, was there something that you would like to try and have demoed while we still have a few minutes left?
I'm okay. This is quite helpful as like understanding the underlying principles.
Cool. I'm glad to hear that. You can always send me a message if there's something that needs more clarification.
Will do.
I'm quite okay. Great. Jose, was this helpful for you today? It would be great to have, as you're sort of the most beginner here, it would be great to have, any feedback from you as to what you think would make it more, more easy or more clear, or help you learn. Yeah, and this is my this is my email, and this is our Discord. So feel free to message me. And yeah, I'm really glad this was actually a small group today, because it was like good discussion, and yeah, I felt we could really talk about the problems, and I got a lot more feedback. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Jose, there's a lot of trial and error involved. You can use ChatGPT for generating React code, and yeah, just let us pop in the Discord, and let us know where you get stuck, and someone will help you out. The great thing about developing with React now is that it's reached critical mass where so many people are using it. If you run into a problem, you're not going to be the only one. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be giving, instead of doing one of these workshops, I'll be giving like a live workshop to a bunch of developers in person, but that will also be live streamed as well, and so we can show our progress there. But then after that, we'll probably be doing another workshop every couple weeks. It won't just be me, and yeah, we'll also demonstrate a whole bunch of different tools, and probably get some more AI tools as well to demo.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, James. Learned some new things.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.